You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next hour or so, we are going to be talking about the 2022-2023 specials, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I am Matt.
I'm John.
And I'm Mark.
And so I was going to do a poll for the 2023 specials, all four of them, and then I realised we hadn't done the 2022 specials either, the three Jodie Whittaker specials. So I thought I'd just fold them into the overall poll, which I suppose gives us a little bit of an idea about how Jodie Whittaker's done against David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa as well, I guess. But mostly it just lets us have those on the score sheet, as it were, seeing as everything else is on the score sheet. Matt has talked about most of these on the podcast before. They're not quite all of them. John's probably talked about most of these on the podcast before too. Mark hasn't had the opportunity to, but he's written about them. Where have you written about them, Mark?
I probably have written a few bits and pieces for Screen Rant.
I've given you an opportunity to advertise your writing.
It's the McDonald's of content creation.
You don't want to advertise. You just want to.
I just get it out there. Do you know what I mean? Just it's like a production line. Much in the same way as Russell T Davies is getting out 2 series of Doctor Who in quick succession, but perhaps.
So Mark's been reviewing Doctor Who for Russell magazine. He doesn't want to talk about it.
Do you know there's a house where I deliver, and I'm not going to say where it is, but I'll just say this. I'm not going to say what road it's on, but I will say this. It's 2 families that have sort of married into each other, one of which the surname is Russell, one of which the surname is Davis, and there's just a big sign on their letterbox saying Russell Davis.
Is it 27 Monks Road?
No, it's not 27 Monks Road.
Is it 28 Monks Road?
It's not on Monks Road. No.
Oh, okay.
Data protection here, man.
39A Pinho Road.
Oh my God, there are 25,000 addresses.
Yeah,
you're going to go through all of them.
We've got time. These podcasts can go on forever.
Right, what I'm going to do is go through the stories one by one, and I will give a few listener comments. And then I'll just ask you three and myself, I guess, what we thought of the stories too. But before we get into it, there are 2 that came top that were split by barely a percentage point or so. The 2 that came top were neck and neck throughout. And actually, the one that won overtook at the very last minute. The one that came second was winning right until the very last 3 sort of results came in. So it was a little bit of
Sea Devils.
It was Legend of the Sea Devils.
I was going to say it's Dylan's vote for the Star Beast that swung that last one, surely.
The one that came in third is a little way behind those. 4th, 5th, and 6th are pretty close together. And funnily enough, 7th is lagging incredibly far behind.
Wonder what that could possibly be.
I mean, it is 30% behind the story above it, which is incredible, really, because the spread here is... Oh, well, actually, I came up with it. I told you the number a few seconds ago, didn't I? There's about a 16% spread if the stories were spread evenly, but 30% is almost double that. So that is quite the way behind. We'll come to it. There was just one comment really about the specials as a whole from Matthew Maisie, who said, what a mix. He said 3 were pretty great. That would be in Wild Blue Yonder, Power of the Doctor, and his favourite, Eve of the Daleks. And he said a sliding scale of not so great for the last 4, but fingers crossed for the future. Right, in 7th place on 7.72% of the overall score it could have achieved. Steve Herr says, he votes at 7th. He says, I could just about accept the sudden materialization of the Sea Devils, but the jump was inexplicable and so poorly executed. Why not just have him disappear and materialize again? Sorry, had to get that off my chest. Ian Charles also put it 7th, said awful. Something went very wrong here. The Sea Devils were well realised, though. Lawrence Hallett, 7th, crap. This one was such a letdown for me, as I have a massive soft spot for the Pertwee Sea Devils, one of my earliest memories being the cliffhanger of the Sea Devil putting its hand through the oil rig door. Poor acting mostly, he says. Underused giant sea beast, comedy pirate outfit on Dan, and of course the terrible Sea Devil comedy jump. Again, this felt too rushed and had the usual Chibnall issues of poor exposition. Will Elliott doesn't put it 7th. Amazingly, Will Elliott puts it 6th and says, I'll take poor CGI over a Panto Merca any day. So in other words, he thinks this compares favourably with Warriors of the Deep.
I think that's fair enough, to be honest.
And David Kitchen puts this 4th, and he just says, I'm an iconoclast at heart. Oh, no, he doesn't. He says, an underrated adventure with a cool monster. I don't even know where to begin with this. But Mark, I am going to begin with you on this one.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Legend of the Sea Devils. What did you think?
It's a mess, but it's not without its charm. I think the comedy pirate costume on Dan is a joke. It's not. Do you know what I mean? Like it's and it has the best joke in the whole special, which is when he apologizes to a pirate for appropriating a pirate costume. That's very funny. You know,
yeah. Well, and of course the joke of it also refers back to the Gunfighters, where Stephen is wearing a sort of comedy cowboy outfit, doesn't he? So this is a direct reference back to that, really.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, I guess.
I think it is. I think that was deliberate.
But yeah, I don't really understand the ending. I don't. There's a lot. It's one of those kind of Doctor Who, and this isn't exclusive to Chris Chibnall. I'd like to point out, but it's definitely one of those kind of modern Doctor Who stories that everything kind of gets thrown at the wall in the last sort of 5-10 minutes because it kind of needs to wrap it up, but then also kind of needs to have a sort of resolution to the Doctor and Yaz sort of love story, as it were. So I think it's trying to do a lot, and it kind of buckles under the swashbuckles under the pressure.
John, this, I mean, I would say famously, but actually rumorously, this was cut to ribbons in the editing room for reasons that nobody's quite sure. So that there's a lot of suggestions as to what those reasons might be. I would suggest, given who's directing and who's writing and the sensitivities and the fact that the series was sold to China, there's been a lot of talk about, they accidentally made it really racist and had to cut it. I doubt that
would that get through the BBC?
I doubt that that's actually the case at all.
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think it would be racism. Sorry to butt in, but I do obviously remember one of the reasons behind Disney remaking Mulan as a live action film was to appeal to the Chinese market because they'd really upset them over kind of not sort of racism, but kind of just insensitively handling and kind of trivializing sort of their sort of, you know, historical and mythological characters. So it's possibly a something more akin to that than actual full-on Talons of Weng-Chiang.
Yeah. Having said that, though, this probably was originally intended to be 60 minutes and it's ended at 45. So it's not like it's lost a scene. It's lost a quarter of its running time, more or less, you would suppose. Yeah. So, John, I'm not going to ask you what you think of the fact that it might be edited, but I'm going to say, do you think the fact that it doesn't quite work is down to the fact that there's probably about 15 minutes worth of material that's missing from the narrative?
It does feel that way. I'd also point out that it is the only Doctor Who story which I think has a credited writer and the director with their first television credit. Yeah. So that isn't going to help at all. There's going to be rough edges on that. I know Chris Chibnall has obviously at least gone over the script, but if you have a director and a writer first time, they're not good. You know, you need some experience to pick up maybe bits and pieces that do work, that don't work, and I don't think they do that all the way through.
There's a lot of first-timers in the Chibnall era, and I wonder if that's one of the reasons why the stories came more slowly than people had expected them to. Because one of the things about it is, if you've got first-timers, and the first-time directors are sort of under the purview of the producer, the sort of line producer, the on-hand producer, rather than the showrunner. And Doctor Who is mostly, these days, more of a producer-led show than a director-led show, really. Except possibly under Stephen Moffat, where they went for sort of slightly more auteurish directors. But other than that, I think But
The
but you're
Chibnall
not wrong.
series does put the director in the opening credits, doesn't it? I think it's first to do that.
Have they not all done that? I think they've all done that, haven't they?
No, just in the actual opening title sequence. Director.
Oh, in the
director's
title sequence
yeah.
itself. Yeah. Oh, yes, but they all give the director's name at the start. That's just television grammar.
Yeah, absolutely.
But my point being, I think if this might be a case of if it's a first-time writer and a first-time director together, then that's sort of like two ways in which you could possibly underachieve, and so they're just going to compound each other, aren't they?
Yeah.
Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot. Tell me some things that are actually to this story's credit rather than
Well,
its
that's
debit
not putting me
column.
on the spot. That's what I was intending to do. I didn't put this last to my poll. I mean, so this is 45, 48 minutes. Eve of the Daleks is an hour, and I kind of wished they were reversed. Eve of the Daleks is predominantly set in the warehouse in Bristol. At least this has colour to it and adventure. So I mean, I didn't rank it as high as David Kitchen, and I wouldn't defend it to the point of being fourth on my list. But Sea Devils, 16th, 17th, 18th century China, costumes, historical boats. I liked the Sea Devil jump. I thought that was quite well done, and it was a fun addition to what Sea Devils can do. And the Sea Devil designs were good. I thought the acting was fine. It was just it was a bit butchered in the plot. But then I kind of don't. I'd rather have a slightly incoherent plot with a lot of fun historical texture than a grinding hours worth of Daleks in a warehouse. To be perfectly honest, I feel more favorable towards this one, and admittedly my feel more favorable towards this one has increased as everybody put it 7th in the poll after I put it 6th, and it's just endless Sea Devil bashing. So yeah, I'm not going to say I can't see things that are wrong with this, and I haven't rewatched it. I've watched it once, but my predominant memory of it is a really nice Sea Devil design, quite nice sets, good lush costumes, and it's a historical. I'm always going to rank historical adventures over kind of contemporary or futuristic adventures because I still think the BBC, even though they're not going to the BBC prop store anymore and building Victorian dens or whatever, I still think the BBC do the past more interestingly than they do the future or the present. I mean, the present tends to be set in filmed in car parks now. So I'm looking forward to the Georgian Regency Doctor Who story. I want them to do more medieval stuff. I want them to explore these things. And compared to, and I like the Chibnall historical ones. I really respect Rosa and Demons of the Punjab. I respect them, but I love the Witchfinders. And this is along those lines. I think this is a kind of an ironic take on history, a little bit subversive, a little bit weird, a little bit offbeat. And so that's my favorite sort of historical adventure.
And I watched it a few weeks ago, just before the Tennant specials started, and yeah, it was still an incoherent mess. But there are lots of things there that you could like if it sort of added up. But anyway, about 30% above that, on 37.4% in 6th place, and with no comments to read out, which I think pretty much says it all. And Matt's just talked about it, but Eve of the Daleks. I mean, John, you're a noted Chibnall phobe, so I'm going to put you on the spot. Tell me some good things about Eve of the Daleks, because I have to say I really enjoyed this one. I thought this one was a lot of fun.
I think it's one of Chibnall's best scripts, and I think it's almost a first draft, not all, just had little bits and pieces done to it at best, which you can see in kind of the way the time loop. Oh, it's getting shorter. But no, it's not, because we need to actually show stuff at the end. Yeah, the premise is neat. Aisling Bea, she's really good in this. I like Pauline McLean as the mother in that. It's a very, having known Irish mothers and had Northern Irish mother-in-law, very accurate. Very accurate. And it's just a really creative way to get around the limitations they had because they were filmed during COVID. I know, so Matt doesn't like the warehouse, but what else can you do, really? You know, you've got as few actors as possible,
Give
as
up.
limited as possible. It's almost like Chibnall has to do at the edge, something like the Edge of Destruction or a bottle show.
Yeah.
As close
Well,
as
and
you get to it,
and
and
that's what it.
he makes it work.
That's also, you know, Doctor Who's never done anything quite like this before. So it's essentially the Base Under Siege story, I guess. But it's not really, is it? It's a sitcom. It's a sitcom that just happens to have A, Daleks in, and B, a sort of Stephen Moffat-esque plot. It's almost like coupling with Daleks, really. That's what this is, essentially. And I think that makes it a lot of fun. Mark, you enjoyed this one, I think.
Yeah, I really like this one. I think, like John says, I think it is one of Chris Chibnall's best scripts. It's certainly his funniest script. And I know that's kind of because you've cast comedy actors, you know,
Yeah.
in the guest roles and in one of the companion roles. But yeah, it's so much fun in a way that I don't think, because it's very simple. Not to kind of continue the Legend of the Sea Devils bashing, but because it's so simple, you can just kind of just refine the script, the dialogue, the kind of relationships between the characters, because literally all you have to do is just kind of repeat the same sequence of events with sort of slight tweaks, whereas Legends of the Sea Devils is a much more kind of complicated plot that has, you know, issues with it. And I know you look, it's a warehouse. Does that make it a special? Yeah, I think it does. It makes the Daleks. I think what Chris Chibnall's done really well is actually make the Daleks kind of scary and threatening again in a way that I think they'd kind of, during Moffat, had kind of just become set dressing a little bit.
I tell you what he's done. He's made them weird and different. Because in that first one, it's a sort of Dalek that's been thrown together from bits and pieces, a junkyard Dalek.
Yeah.
In the second one, it's Daleks that have been redesigned by somebody who doesn't know what Daleks are. And then in this third one, it's the Daleks that are caught up in a sort of time paradox, time eddy, sort of time repeating plot. So he's made the Daleks weird, is what he's done. He's taken what the Daleks are, what we expect, and he's twisted that.
I mean, Resolution redid, you know, it redid Dalek essentially. It's one Dalek can be terrifying.
And I think that one last sort of thing on Eve of the Daleks that I really like is it's relatable characters. You know, Aisling Bea, her mother, people you recognize, but not in that kind of RTD way where everybody's just a little bit more heightened.
Yeah.
And a bit more kind of caricature. You know, just Aisling Bea's line of, if, you know, our survival relies on my mother calling at a time I would like her to call me, we're all doomed, kind of thing. That's brilliant. That's one of the best jokes in all of Doctor Who. So I'm a big fan of this one. Sorry, Matt.
Matt, one thing you liked about Eve of the Daleks?
Oh, so one thing I liked, it was shown on the 1st of January. So a grim, unrelenting time loop episode set in a warehouse in Manchester put me in the right frame of mind for a New Year special. Because
it's a metaphor for Brexit Britain.
1st of January is one of the most depressing days of the year.
And yet, this was the funniest episode of Doctor Who in 5 years.
I can't remember the jokes, but I mean, so I have to rewatch it. But my overriding moment, I'm not the best audience for it because I hate time loop stories, or I dislike time loop stories because they just do the same thing with variations, and there's a predictability behind them, and they've been done so many times. Heaven Sent.
That's just jealousy from Seasons of War, isn't it? Me taking all your glory.
Heaven Sent, I kind of liked because it was time loop, but it had, you know, a gothic setting, and Peter Capaldi really it was just Peter Capaldi acting his socks off, and it worked for me. This seems to be Heaven Sent, but kind of without the kind of color and without the gothicness. And
it's got Aisling Bea in it.
Yeah, I liked Aisling Bea. But, you know, you take an actress like Aisling Bea, a comedian like Aisling Bea, and you put her in a dark warehouse selling cans of soup in Manchester, and it just brings me down. It's a bummer. That's all I can remember.
John, I'll tell you one thing this story does that no other Doctor Who story, to my memory, has ever done. There's probably a couple of examples. The cliffhanger, as you go into the opening titles, it kills off the TARDIS team.
Well, I did that in 2014, 2015.
Oh, stop banging on about that.
What is that for the ever unreadable Seasons of War?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So proud to be in such esteemed company.
It's an arresting cliffhanger, because the question is, it's a shock image, and then you get, how do they get out of that? Well, what's going to happen? How do they play the episode out? So it's not, it's a why. It turns the question into why rather than how. A sort of Columbo way, Columbo kind of thing. Which is again, I think the episode's credit.
It also has one of my favourite Jodie Whittaker line deliveries, which is just that kind of very quiet, not like this. That's great, like the Doctor's been shot at by Daleks before, but like to actually kind of, oh no, this time they've got me, and this is it's brilliant. Right,
moving on to 5th place. I don't know if it's a surprise that this has ended up as low as it has, on 43.09%. Lawrence Hallett says he votes it 5th. He says, for me, a bit of a mess, but he says my nostalgia for the comic strip kept me from feeling too negatively towards it. Ian Charles also puts it 5th, and he says it's fun, but he says paper thin plot. And Luke Hammond puts it 4th, says felt in many ways like a run-of-the-mill RTD season opener, but I can't deny it was nice to see David Tennant again, and I like how it fixes what happened to Donna in Journey's End. And yeah, for me, the way it fixes that was one of the highlights of it. The way it dealt with sort of the issues that it dealt with in the resolution. Not necessarily the clunkiness of it, but the way it brought those things in to resolve the story, I thought was a highlight. The lack of hardly any plot whatsoever, I thought was typical RTD, but I kind of was hoping for a bit more. Mark, you weren't here for that one either. What did you think of the Star Beast?
So I also like the comic strip, but the comic strip is 6-7 parts, I think, weekly, Doctor Who Weekly, a couple of pages. So
I think it's 4 pages each issue, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that. So it's like really just
yeah.
ticking along. That it's not enough to kind of turn into an hour. So what Russell T does is he kind of, obviously you've got all the Donna stuff, but even with that, it never quite feels enough to kind of give it the full hour. And my main issue, it's not the how they fix Donna, because of course we all want Donna to be fixed and remember all her experiences and have a lovely time.
But also you want it done here so they can just get on and have 2 episodes with her afterwards, right?
Because it would just be tedious for people to be constantly going, oh, look over there, Donna, for like 3 hours.
Imagine if Wild Blue Yonder was...
I'd watch that. Hooray! Not that, no, there.
It's just a giant spaceship and the Doctor playing hide and seek with Donna. Matt's not laughing. He's not amused.
No, I just know. Sorry, I
got
distracted by Wikipedia because there's a character called Fudge Merchandani. And I can't remember who.
Oh, the character is called Fudge in the strip.
It's a little boy.
Yeah.
He's a main character in the comic strip. In the TV, he's reduced to a single line of dialogue, I think.
Oh, okay.
He looks out a window at one point as well. But my main issue with that resolution is the clunkiness of then tying it into the very honourable and well-meaning message, but it's very, very poorly handled. The sort of the line, something a male presenting Time Lord would not understand, would be fine if Jodie Whittaker hadn't just been Doctor Who.
Yeah,
because you would kind of at least remove the kind of the transness of that, because essentially what that does, because Jodie Whittaker is regenerated into David Tennant, referring to David Tennant as a male presenting Time Lord, does that kind of rather unpleasant thing of kind of erasing trans men. I feel that, and for Russell T to kind of go on rightly in Doctor Who Confidential about the importance of these issues. I think to kind of mishandle it like that, it's kind of unforgivable, but that's my main issue with it.
It kind of says trans people are all right as long as it's men becoming women.
Yeah.
Basically.
And it does essentially apply that it's not Rose's decision in the first place.
Yes. Yeah, there's that element of it as well. That she's only trans because she's got Time Lord energy in her brain.
Because her mum, because of what her mum did 15 years ago, whatever it was.
It does feel like Russell T Davies is commendably including sort of inclusive politics and inclusive identity stuff in his scripts, and that's commendable, but it does feel like the sort of stuff that in about 10 years time it's going to be out of date, and all of these groups and us are going to look back and wince and think, well, that was commendable, but they mishandled that, or he got advice from one person for that, and actually there's a whole debate out here going,
That's fair, but then you look at the Curse of Peladon or Colony in Space or the Mutants or something, and they're equally as out of date. I think you've just got to make television programs for the audience who are watching them on the day, and then it becomes an historical document, really.
Yeah, they're out of date after about 30 years. I think this might be a little bit. I think things are more pacey. Possibly.
Well, yes, but I mean, the point is you make it for the audience who are watching it now, I think. That would be my argument to that, I guess. Everybody's just waiting for me to finish my drink.
Well, you'll get a pass on that. I'm waiting to see if it's John or me that gets next.
Well, I think it's just a conversation, so just jump in. Go on then, Matt. The Star Beast.
I think
now that it's had time to sink in a bit.
I think it does the job. In retrospect, now we've seen all three of the Tennant specials. I think it does the job it sets out to do. I always knew that always suspected this was going to be my least favourite of the three, partly because it's a Russell T Davies opener, as one of the comments said, and Russell T Davies openers are never to my taste. They always do something, but they seem to be successful in doing it. They seem to lay the foundations for people to come back and to grow audiences. He seems to be skilled at that. So I never find them inspiring, but I'm almost tempted to look at these three specials as one piece rather than three individual stories, even though they're not one individual story, but there's sort of, they each do a particular job at the time, and together they all do something different, and they've all got a different texture and a tone. They're demonstrating something about the new scale of Doctor Who. Although ironically, the Star Beast, as I think Dylan's talked about, looks a little bit cheap. It looks a bit sort of retrograde when compared to some of Chibnall's stuff. But I think that's a directing thing, which ironically, as JR said, is one of the better directors that we've had in modern Doctor Who. So there's quirks here, but I thought it was fine, and I laughed at a lot of the jokes. So
the weird thing about it is Russell T Davies has come back after all this time and kind of said, I'm in a different place now, I'm going to do Doctor Who differently. And then he's got three specials, and just 3 episodes gives you a chance to really rethink how you're going to go about doing it. And basically he's written a season opener, a season closer, and the weird one from in the middle of the series. So he's just basically boiled an entire series of Russell T Davies Doctor Who, which he's already done 4 times, into 3 episodes, which are just exactly what you would have expected from one of those seasons 15 years ago.
Do you get the impression that so we know that lots of different stories have been cooking in Russell T Davies's brain and lots of ideas for how seasons will work. But these 3 won't have been cooking in Russell T Davies's brain, because these 3 are David Tennant and Catherine Tate come back. So these 3 would have been written sort of almost from a blank page. So that kind of makes sense.
Well, he could have the premises in his head quite easily.
Yeah. What we really need to do is see what an 8-episode Ncuti Gatwa season looks like. And if that really is just a David Tennant season with 5 episodes missing, that's when we're thinking, oh, wow, did you really need... I mean, because I want to see what Russell T Davies does if Russell T Davies is doing something differently. But if he's just doing the same thing, I'm not interested. John, how about you? The Star Beast as well.
Star Beast, yeah, it's exactly it's a Russell T Davies soap opera. It's light on its feet. It's very the plot, the alien plot is an excuse almost, and it's the characters. He wants to write these characters again. He introducing the characters. He effectively gets over what you remembered well about these characters, and what I really do like about it, and across the specials, is the way it does acknowledge that time has passed. It acknowledges these are different people to what they were. The Doctor has had experiences that have changed him. He's been Jodie Whittaker, he's been Matt Smith, he's been Peter Capaldi. He's discovered things about himself that he didn't know. That's fundamentally changed. And
yeah, he's still exactly the same as he was 15 years ago.
Oh, he's not. It's. I like David Tennant's performance a lot more than I like his older one now. It's less brash, I would say.
It's a bit slower.
Softer.
Yeah, he's definitely 15 years older, and I do appreciate that he's 15 years older.
As well. Yeah,
but I think he's basically just given the same performance 15 years later.
I think it's slightly different. It's more emotionally intelligent than his other one. His other one was very much, again, and this is to do with what he did to Donna back then. It was, he didn't bother to say, I am this guy. This is what I do. I will change you. This is how I will save you. White male savior figure. And that changes it. He has to learn not to be that. And again, that's part of what these specials do across those 3 episodes.
Right, let's move on from white male savior figures, because in 4th place on 48.78%, so just a little way above the Star Beast, and still less than 50%. So this wasn't liked enough to get it above 50%. David Ewan, who's gone to his Welsh spelling of his surname now, which is nice to see. I hope I'm still pronouncing it correctly.
Ewan,
Yeah, he put this in 7th. He says, not sure what the fuss is about. Ncuti was very good, but this was wafer thin and pretty slow. George Machin, 5th place. I love Ncuti. He's a brilliant Doctor already. However, my biggest issue with this episode is Tonderai's direction. It seems to take his worst tendencies from the Chibnall era episodes and make them even worse. The same episode in the hands of someone else might have seen this rocket up my list. And I think both that and what we were saying about Rachel Talalay on the last one probably go towards what I said earlier about Doctor Who being a bit more of a producer-led show, especially under Russell T Davies, where the sort of visuals and the sort of speed and the tone of it is led by the producer rather than the director, I think. Anyway, Jimmy Twizzle put this 2nd, and he says a great start for Ncuti, which makes me excited about the future. The weird thing about this is that there was a lot of love for Ncuti, and then a lot of people saying, but I don't know about the episode. And then there were a handful of people who really loved it. And I found that in the reaction sort of on Twitter and in places like that too. There are some people who just think this was a brilliant, brilliant episode. And then kind of, I'd say probably just over half seem to be thinking, well, the regulars are great. The episode itself, not so much. Mark, I'm fascinated to know what you think, because I have no idea what you think of this. But
I'm in the I love Ncuti Gatwa, Millie Gibson, but I'm not 100% sold on the episode camp.
Right.
Because I think there's something, and this may seem hypocritical from somebody who praised Eve of the Daleks, but at least it had a time loop to explain why they're stuck in a warehouse for an hour. A lot of it, like a surprising amount of it, takes place within that tiny flat.
Oh, I counted, and it's actually 88.7% of the episode takes place.
It's mental to me that you would do that on a Christmas special, Doctor Who, relaunching for a new era, although arguably it's not. It's going to do that in May. But yeah, it just all mostly takes place in that flat. The goblin ship, barely. The goblins, I don't really understand what that they feed on coincidences. Sure, fine. There's some lovely lines in it. There's some great moments in it. But it really doesn't hang together very well. It feels like a kind of Russell T Davies attempt at doing a Stephen Moffat story, but he doesn't quite have the nous for the tricksy plotting that all kind of comes together like a jigsaw puzzle or a well-designed clock that Moffat has, you know.
This reminded me of the what's the Toby Whit Under the Lake and Before the Flood
Oh, right.
in that
Yeah.
respect, because that felt like an attempt to do a Stephen Moffat grandfather paradox that was so straightforward it was barely even a paradox, let alone involving a grandfather. That's
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah. It's the whole, you know, oh, she's gone back. They've gone back in time and, you know, taken the baby or whatever. What I would say is that I think the main, if we're talking about kind of what has Russell T actually changed between 2009 and, you know, 2023, I think he's a lot more confident in just allowing Doctor Who to be Doctor Who. I feel like Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor is very much written as, look, he's an alien time and space traveler. It's fine, just go with it. Whereas I think he was always a little bit cagey about that in the early days. It was always kind of putting the focus on the companion or kind of rooting it in a kind of believable reality. Whereas this has got, you know, goblins feeding on coincidences and magic gravity gloves and all that stuff. He doesn't care anymore because he knows that for the past 18 years, people have been watching Doctor Who.
And yet then he'll do something really weird. Like he'll insist on the Doctor insisting that the goblins are time riders, not real proper time travelers.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they then go on to travel back in time, like 20 years, to the exact moment Ruby
That's
is
a nice,
left.
that's a nice character beat, though, isn't it? That's
It's
just
a nice
saying,
yeah.
because that's one of the moments when I thought, oh, Ncuti Gatwa, he's playing the Doctor here because he's got that kind of slight pomposity about time travelers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of this could be a John Pertwee here. I like that. I really like that bit.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but the two things about that were, why did it have to be that bit? Couldn't it have been something that made a bit more sense in the story? And the whole thing seemed to be so that he could just get Ncuti Gatwa to say the line "like wow" unquote, which I thought was one of the most bizarre moments in the whole thing. I just, where did that come from and what was the point of it? I've never heard anybody describe something as like wow.
You know, hanging out with the young people, you know.
No, maybe not. No, but I do. Do you know what I mean? I've got two kids, exactly the sort of right ends of the age group that you would hear. I hear the way kids speak all the time, and yet that just felt like somebody who's in his 60s who doesn't know how kids speak.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah. John, what did you think of the Church on Ruby Road, for the benefit of anybody who's not heard you talking about it yet?
It's another RTDC's Nopa, essentially. Again, that plot is light. It's just bypass it, go as far as possible, get a nice little guest star in, and all it's looking to do is to set up the new series. So essentially, you don't need to do that season opener, although I suspect we'll get another kind of season opener type episode. But that's what it does.
Space babies.
It's a soft, it's kind of that soft kind of Russell T Davies season reboot. So you get the new Doctor. Again, I think what I didn't say on the episode itself. I thought that episode kind of, the pacing went a little early on, and as you said, I think last time we talked, it was that new scene that was inserted at when Russell T got the note from Disney. It's not from Millie Gibson's point of view. It's a pure Doctor scene. It's a lovely Doctor scene, but it just felt out of place totally. It broke the rhythm for me. And it got worse when I rewatched it.
And actually, the funny thing about that, it's a nice scene.
It's the best scene in the whole thing, I would say. But yeah,
but it's 3 or 4 minutes. Imagine how light this episode had been if it hadn't had that in as well. It would have been down to about 50 minutes or so, and it would have felt really, really light. Matt, what did you think of the
They cut scenes from the flat. They cut dialogue from the flat.
Wow, that would have pushed it above 90%.
Yeah.
JL's had a time on this.
I don't like Christmas specials, but I don't like Russell T Davies Christmas specials particularly because his idea of Christmas and what makes Christmas fun and enjoyable isn't my idea of Christmas fun. So we have conflicting ideas about Christmas, but so Ncuti Gatwa was great. Yeah, what irritates me more is having watched all the sort of background stuff, the making of the Unleashed thing and the commentaries about how much Russell T Davies says this is a new thing. This is Doctor Who doing something he's never done before. We're breaking real new ground with this and Doctor Who. And so I sort of watched it thinking, when is the new ground? When can I see new ground? And what he actually means is he's breaking new ground potentially on what he did maybe early on in series 1, but actually even he covered this ground later on. So it just kind of irritates me. I know it's all sort of sales pitch and it's getting people watching, and I respect that. So it was all right. It didn't inspire me particularly, but a lot of people really liked it, and that's the important thing. And if they come back to the series at some point in the upcoming series, Russell T Davies, like a stopwatch, is going to hit upon the thing that I really like, where I think, this is the Doctor Who I like. So I'm looking forward to that moment.
Yeah. Well, we might talk about it in a moment. The other thing about Russell T Davies, and I've not watched any of the behind the scenes stuff for this episode yet, so I don't know if he's done it with this one, but I remember he's done it several times before. One example, for instance, was with Gridlock, and I remember him saying afterwards, I was tempted to tell a really interesting story about the Macra that would actually have made sense, but I decided not to because I wanted to make the episode about the characters. And all I could think was, why didn't you tell the interesting story that made sense and a story about the characters? It's not a zero-sum game. And that's the thing. I was thinking about this. The goblins are almost entirely missing from the story. There could have been an interesting story about them too, and it wouldn't have had much on the running time, and it would just have given those 60 minutes a bit more substance.
And that's the other frustrating thing is we kind of had rumors about this before we had pretty much the entire story outline, or we had suggestions of what it would be, and it sounded so much like a kind of Russell T Davies does Labyrinth, which I kind of thought, wow, well, that really works, because Labyrinth is sort of Christmassy. It sort of feels like you could add the Doctor to it, and it would be great. Labyrinth had David Bowie playing the Goblin King in a really enigmatic performance, and had something like an actual sort of texture to it. It had a labyrinth, and it had David Bowie at the end of the labyrinth. And this just didn't have anything. It's like he took the idea of Labyrinth and just took away all the interesting stuff and just had the goblins singing with the baby in the middle of the room. And that was what he took from Labyrinth.
It's like he took Labyrinth and wrote a sort of 2-paragraph outline of what Labyrinth was, and that was the be-all and end-all of his own script.
It's like he took
David Bowie.
It's like he took Labyrinth and he spent 90 minutes of Labyrinth in Jennifer Connelly's bedroom before she actually got into the labyrinth, and then she got into the labyrinth a little bit, and then it wasn't David Bowie in the end, and then she goes back to the bedroom, and that's it.
Yeah,
that's what Russell T Davies decided to do with Labyrinth.
But I worry that that's Russell T Davies's take on Doctor Who, which is no, nobody's interested in the Goblin Kingdom. They want to see a tiny flat in London. And I really worry. Everybody's talking about this sort of Disney Plus money. I don't think we're seeing it go all that far. I mean, obviously, the practical effects are great. I love the Goblin King, all that stuff. Fantastic, brilliant, great. But there's a very small vision here compared to what we've just had with like the Flux, the Power of the Doctor. It's it's just back to council estates. And
episode 4 of the new series, it's just gonna be solid gold sets. Just real, just authentically gold.
Return to Volga.
Sets.
Have you heard? Okay, everybody who's listening or watching who doesn't want to know any spoilers for next year, put your fingers in your ears for about 60 seconds. But apparently, the plot for episode 3. And if you can, so I'm going to give you 2 ideas of what the plot might be. The plot for episode 3 is the Dr. Light episode. There's 8 episodes and there's a Dr. Light episode because he spends the entire episode with his foot stuck on a hand grenade like Harry Sullivan did at the start of Genesis of the Daleks. Now, if it was written by Russell T Davies, then that's probably all you'd get. He'd be standing in a flat with a hand grenade and his foot's on it, and you've got 45 minutes of people talking to him. Or it could be the Stephen Moffat episode, which people are expecting, which might make it a little bit more interesting than that. We'll have to wait and see. But you know what I mean? that's the ambition of this series. The Doctor spends 45 minutes with his foot on a hand grenade.
I'm going to credit my podcast colleague, well, my other podcast colleague, Ben Verth, with his concern, which is that the scene in this in which the Doctor and Ruby are kind of running on a treadmill while a sort of big fat lad tries to eat them is kind of his vision of what's to come with Doctor Who. It's just kind of just a conveyor belt of, you know, standard stuff to basically feed Ian Levine. And those kind of people that, you know, want Doctor Who all year round, regardless of, you know, the fact that might mean it becomes really homogenized and predictable and boring and, you know, the same old.
They just nailed it. Church on Ruby Road is Love and Monsters, right?
Yeah.
But you know that once or twice in a year, you will accidentally hit gold.
Yeah,
There
sure.
will be something good. There will be something good because there hasn't been a Russell T Davies year where he hasn't managed to hit gold once or twice, I think.
But
I'd
mostly
say that about all the showrunners, though. Let's be honest.
Well, that's you know, my expectations are low. I'm fine.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. It's just all these other people that still think it's kind of Lord Russell or our glorious savior. Where it's like, well, no, it's just gonna, you know.
Yeah.
Do you know,
Anyway.
I'd have loved 5 minutes more of the Goblin just being complete arseholes to everyone.
Yeah, give that
that would've been
Goblin
brilliant.
King a voice and let him be an arsehole and give him 5 minutes where he just spews nonsense about the human race and about, you know, they have this song about the goblins eating babies, right? Which is a pretty weird and grotesque, and going back to what I said before, a sort of Roald Dahl-esque idea to throw out on Christmas Day. Double down on that. Get the Goblin King saying, why do we eat babies? We eat babies because they're the freshest you can get. Do you know this
for a
sort of
laugh?
stuff? Yeah, give him 5 minutes of that. It would have been great. And it would have given the episode something in the middle. Whereas in the end, the episode just felt like it was weighted towards the beginning and the end. And the middle was just kind of nothing, really. Anyway, let's move on to the top 3. So there's a bit of a jump now of just over 16%, actually, going back to that number. That's the number for the night, isn't it? 16%. I'm going to look it up now and find out that 1/7 is actually like 18% or something, aren't I? I'm going to work it out while somebody's talking. 65.04%. Jeff Waddle put this 7th. He said, I couldn't make out a word of dialogue and I am not watching it again, ever. So
nice
Jeff Waddle.
It's nice to have Jeff Waddle back.
He's really not a Tennant Tate fan.
He's
However,
got opinions.
Yeah. But then he liked the Church on Ruby Road. So this is a Tennant and Tate thing rather than a Russell T Davies thing. Everybody else who's commented or whose comments I've got here have put this first. George Machin, it's no Heaven Sent or The Girl Who Waited, but it's a story in those veins, exploring a mystery location with a small cast as the mystery unfolds, which are among my favourite type of Doctor Who story. David Kitchen says the least special of the list, so perhaps the reason why I liked it the most. And David Ewan says something different in a banal Saturday schedule. The subdued Tennant left me wanting him to stay after seeing these specials. It is, of course, Wild Blue Yonder, which I accidentally wrote Wide Blue Yonder, because that's how I always knew the expression when I was growing up. Matt, actually, you're the one who didn't get to review this on the episode where we talked about it yourself. So this is kind of your first opportunity to talk about it. But you really liked this, didn't you?
Are you going to mark first then? Yes, I did really.
Okay,
like
now that you've made that joke, Mark.
No.
I defer to my learned colleague.
Thank you. I did really like this, and I think this lives or dies with how creepy you find the not things, and that kind of particularly that first bit where he keeps saying my arms are too long, and how well that performance works, and how you find that sort of that weird distortion to be creepy. And I found it really creepy. I thought it was really sinister. I thought it was a sort of Stephen Moffat moment, particularly with that sort of catchphrase. Beyond that, I thought it looks fine, and I really liked. It's two people on a spaceship, but I was pretty absorbed. I wasn't expecting a multi-Doctor story with this. Obviously, it's not going to be a multi-Doctor story,
It is.
Although it
It-
technically
sorry?
is, yeah.
Well,
Technically is.
technically. So the fact that it didn't do anything dramatic with the mythology of the series, it just kind of built this kind of creep. I preferred it to Midnight, which I've always felt was a little bit. I've always found Midnight to be a bit dull. It's a bottle episode and it's a little bit stagey, but it's too stagey for me. It's filled with actors who act like they are on the stage, whereas there was actually some degree of exploration of this spaceship. So yeah, I really liked it.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it stands or falls as well on whether you like Tennant and Tate. And I'm not struggling with Tennant and Tate as much in these 3 specials as I would have done if they'd have done 10 or 15 episodes or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, this worked for me a lot better than it would have otherwise. And there are story logicalities that Russell T Davies just doesn't bother with, just like he didn't in Midnight. But then I guess you don't expect him to, and so that's probably a good thing. I think, for instance, the bi-generation in The Church on Ruby Road, he never bothered to explain that on screen, and I was absolutely fine with that because I knew that there was an explanation for it off screen that worked. I think my problem with Wild Blue Yonder and Midnight is there's no off-screen explanation that works. He's just interested in the concept, and I don't think he cares whether it makes any sense. So I thought it was fine, but I didn't love it. Mark, what did you think of Wild Blue Yonder?
Well, I did love it. No, I really liked it. And I think sometimes you don't need that off screen. I think it's enough to kind of, and sure, maybe it's a hand wavy. Ooh, there were some things beyond our ken, but sure. Why
I
not?
like to think that the writer knows, even if he's not telling us. But in this case, I didn't think he knew either.
I think this is good. And I think it's interesting what David Kitchen says about kind of the least special, quote unquote. But that's what I like about it, and I know that's why he likes it as well. But it's the idea that you got David Tennant and Catherine Tate back, which is special enough. You know, they're one of the most popular, well, the most popular kind of TARDIS team of the kind of modern era. And you don't just
Possibly
have them
with the exception, of course, just to break in on that point, possibly with the exception, of course, of Tennant and Billy Piper.
Oh yeah, but
because that
nobody
seems
cares
to have
about
been. But those were the 2 that everybody loved back.
But do you know what it is, though? I think it's because Tennant and Tate were hugely popular on TV, but then
Yeah.
their friendship became a whole thing as well. So they were doing like radio shows together. They were doing Catherine Tate's show, doing Shakespeare in the West End. You know, I think that's why it's kind of made people forget about Tennant and Piper. But to have them back and not just go, right, we're going to do one episode where they fight the Daleks, one episode where they fight the Cybermen, one episode where they fight the Toymaker, I think is very much to Russell T's credit. And he throws in a really kind of weird existentialist horror movie in the middle, like a kind of PG version of Event Horizon. That's really bold. And that gives me hope for the future, that he's kind of doing that kind of thing. And you've got 2 Doctors and 2 Donners. That's and Bernard Cribbins turns up at the end. It's lovely. It's just great.
And the pre-title sequence.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's just a daft bit about, and that as well. Wokeness, all that nonsense. Oh, they've cast an Asian actor to play Sir Isaac Newton in a throwaway cameo, which has nothing to do with the fact that
Sorry, you took a while to get to the point, and I did think you were actually on the side of all this woke nonsense.
That was going to be the twist. Yeah, I'm actually just. I'm the not wee mark that is actually just really racist.
And now we should have half an hour on trans issues and see how far we can get before we finally lose the podcast.
Tonight, Matthew, Mark is Ricky Gervais.
But the idea of, you wouldn't cast a white man as Martin Luther King, would you? It's like, well, no, you wouldn't, because any story about Martin Luther King would be intrinsically linked to the civil rights movement.
Well, actually, yes, you absolutely damn well would, because we took till 1999 till we had the first black Othello. So absolutely, yes, you would cast a white guy as Martin Luther King, and you'd black him up.
1999?
Oh, something like that. I don't know.
Is
this
it the
specific one.
on-screen one, right?
The first
Should
screen,
be.
the first black
probably
screen
yeah.
Othello was in
I
the
would imagine the
90s.
RSC must have done it on stage before then.
Yeah, but do you know what I mean? I'm saying if white people can still be playing black characters well into the 1990s on screen, then yes, you absolutely would have a white guy playing Martin Luther King.
Sure. And all I'm saying is that Sir Isaac Newton having a TARDIS fall, well, not a TARDIS fall on his head, a TARDIS drop an apple on his head, doesn't matter what his skin color is, it's just a stupid joke.
Or is it
With
an
repercussions.
ongoing plot development that's going to come back?
No. Although, well,
Okay.
kind of, I suppose.
Mark's
but-
team Matt.
We're
It's
still
gonna
getting
be a
Mavity.
recurring
We do-
gag. That's it.
Yes.
No, I don't think so. The way Tennant looks at Tate when she says Mavity and he corrects himself after he says gravity and she says what? That is not just a gag. Anyway, John, what did you think of Wild Blue Yonder?
God, people should listen to previous episodes for it. Obviously, I'm absolutely.
They should,
happy
but
with
you're
this,
here.
guys.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's move on.
I
In
loved
second
it
place,
anyway.
no, go on.
Yeah, no, it's again, it's that kind of the old first episode, the old Hartnell first episode, where they just go exploring somewhere to set things up. It's an very old school episode. I think they quoted the Ark in Space, didn't they? Is that what they were looking to emulate? Combined with we can do better than Underworld these days, so we can do that whole special effects thing. And it's got some brilliantly weird imagery to it. It's got some lovely off-key performances. It's you know. That it's being sold by the actors as much as anything else, and they're phenomenal in the way they differentiate between the two of them. So yeah, I love it. It gives Tennant and Tate a chance to stretch themselves and have fun. I'm
Right,
glad you got that.
up to 73.17%. Oh, and I looked it up. It's not 16%. It's
14.
14.3%. In second place, Luke Hammond voted this fifth. Actually, this is not an isolated opinion. He said an overstuffed mess, trying to do way too much at the expense of a compelling story. Bear in mind, this was the one that was winning until 3 votes from the end of the poll. He says the Master's Rah Rah Rasputin dance is, of course, hilarious, but even there, it's a shame they didn't make such a great idea the focus of an episode, perhaps with the meddling monk making a return, JR? I mean, I still contend the only other Time Lord that it makes sense to bring back is the meddling monk because of the kind of stories you'd tell. I don't see what stories you'd tell with the Rani, but I do see what stories you could tell with the monk, which are about time paradoxes, right? Anyway, Tim Ullman votes this first. He says, slightly to my own surprise, having mostly disliked the whole Chibnall-Whittaker era, I've picked Power of the Doctor as number 1 in this list. In truth, it's probably complete rubbish, but it was such an unashamed exercise in fan service, I couldn't help being charmed by it. So for now, Chibnall nostalgia tops RTD nostalgia. Will Elliott first, best serving of fan wank since 1983, and Alistair Thwaite first. Fairly consistent standard here of decently entertaining episodes across the 7, he says, with Power as the obvious standout. 13 and Yaz's final scenes together are beautifully sweet and understated. And I can't disagree with that, actually. I think the way they did an unrequited love story there felt a lot less egregious and needy than the sort of unrequited love story between Ten and Rose. So I was actually on board for that, I think. I thought this was great. Mark, think you thought this was great, if I remember rightly, from On the Time Lash?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know that this could have potentially been Doctor Who's big finale and kind of a de facto 60th anniversary special until the BBC got a co-production partner and a new sort of showrunner and all that kind of thing. But RTD knocks on the door and he comes in and saves the day.
Having
But-
said that, just on that point, though,
Mm.
the BBC have said now that they were looking for a streaming service to partner on Doctor
Yeah, they
Who
were.
way
But
before.
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
They were never going to count. Like everybody's said, Russell T saved. That's not true.
No.
What was going to happen was it would probably have been rested for a little bit while they were trying to work out a deal to continue the show with a streamer.
A bit like in 1989, except in 1989,
Yeah.
they took so long deciding who it was
Yes.
going to be. It turned out to be 7 years.
Exactly. So it's a kind of lovely last. I mean, if that was the case, it's a brilliant last hurrah for a kind of modern Doctor Who, because it kind of brings everything together. It ties everything together. It brings the classic series and the new series together. This kind of great story that I think absolutely nails its colours to the mast on Jodie Whittaker is the Doctor, whether you like it or not, because it brings back all these old Doctor actors, and they're not there to patronize Jodie Whittaker's Doctor. They're not there to kind of save the day in her stead. They're there to go, look, you got to keep fighting. You're the Doctor. We all accept you as this kind of, the next incarnation.
Do you know, I've never sort of given my theory as to what Chris Chibnall's underlying theme was across his entire sort of 5 years of Doctor Who. I keep meaning to, and I just never seem to get round to it, but it's sort of come up now. And I think it's basically this. I think he's basically written the first woman Doctor and then made it a sort of subtext of the entire 5 years. That every story, and when I say story, sometimes it's the whole series, sometimes it's a two-parter, sometimes it's a thread, sometimes it's just within one episode. But there's a theme there of this isn't Doctor Who. And then by the end of the story, you find out that, yes, of course, it's Doctor Who. So in that first year, he goes back to basics so far. It doesn't feel like the Doctor Who that you've had. But of course, it's exactly the Doctor Who that you'd had in 1963. And then at the end of that first series, he does Resolution. And it's like, oh, yes, of course, it's Doctor Who. In Flux, you've got 3 Doctors. These aren't Doctor Who. Which one of these is Doctor Who? Of course, they're all Doctor Who. In the Timeless Child storyline, oh, Doctor Who's not who you thought they were. Oh, yes, but of course it is. Then you've got the bit where it's not really Jodie Whittaker, but it's really Jodie Whittaker. And in The Power of the Doctor, you've got, oh, it's not Doctor Who because it's the Master inhabiting the Doctor's body. And then again, it comes back to, oh, no, but the Doctor reasserts herself. And of course, yes, it is Doctor Who. So I think that's a running theme across the Chris Chibnall era. And I think that ties in. And I don't know how deliberate it is, but I've just given like 5 examples without even thinking about it. So I think it must be deliberate.
Yeah, and I think also, I think a lot of people gave, myself included, I hold my hands up to it, but I think a lot of people gave Chibnall stick for not making more of a deal of it being the first female Doctor. Like it was kind of like, she's the first female Doctor, let's just get on with it being Doctor Who. And I think that's a very admirable way to do it now in retrospect, whereas I think we all wanted kind of different stories, and I think there's definitely places for that. You get in the Witchfinders, you get Byron flirting with the Doctor in the Villa of Diodati, but ultimately what Chibnall's trying to do for that whole 5 years is kind of like you say, it's like there is no such thing as not Doctor Who. Well, there is, but it's kind of, it's a movable feast. It can be whatever you kind of want it to be. Well, exactly.
There's a brilliant line is it in the Peter Capaldi era somewhere? I think it's in Moffat anyway, where one of the Doctors says, oh, something like, he's the first Doctor, he's the second Doctor, and then it comes back to, but I'm just the Doctor. And there's like no, we're all the same character. You might differentiate by numbers, but when it comes down to it, whichever one of us you see on screen at any one time is just the Doctor. And I think basically that's what there are 2 ways he could have gone. He could have leaned into the fact that it was the first woman, or he could just have said, this is the character that's on the screen, it's just the Doctor. Yeah. And that was the choice he made. And either way, 50% of people would have said you should have done the other thing, right?
Well, yeah, and that is fundamentally what The Power of the Doctor is about. It is about, ultimately, she was always the Doctor, and it doesn't matter about the Timeless Children, it doesn't matter about anything. It takes apart the idea of the Doctor because the Master is trying to deconstruct the role of the Doctor and kind of corrupt it and turn it into something evil. It's great. I really, really love it.
Matt, you must have appreciated that as well then, because we had lengthy discussions about the fob watch getting tucked away and the fact that no, it's not about the fob watch, it's about, and I appreciate that you don't think they did anything with the storyline, but the reassertion of the fact that the character is just the Doctor and that's what it's really about.
Yeah, so the Timeless Child thing, my view was it's not a mythology busting thing they did any more than Bi-Regeneration or Bi-Generation isn't mythology busting, doesn't actually do anything. But with Timeless Children, the whole point was not opening the fob watch. It is acknowledging that Timeless Children doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where she came from. The fact is she's the Doctor. And so she's, you know, the thing that matters is what she does, not where she comes from. That might be reversed. I don't know. I don't know if Russell T Davies is going to sort of investigate. I suspect not. I suspect Ncuti Gatwa's I was adopted too is more a kind of a connection with the companion, move on moment. So
then again, though, I could see Russell T Davies being the one to investigate if anybody does. I could see that.
Yeah, because Chibnall doesn't tend to mind it for emotional impact, I don't think. Not as Russell T Davies would. Russell T Davies can find the drama in the story.
Yeah, but he'll find the drama without revelations, I think. So he might find drama in the fact that the Doctor's adopted.
What I mean
I
is the
think
Doctor
it will
might
be
look,
more...
won't find anything, but the Doctor will be impacted by the fact that they looked and didn't find anything.
Yeah, it's not Russell T Davies, it's more of a Stephen Moffat thing to actually then go back in time in the 70th special to find Tecteun and do this and this. So
with a hand around the Doctor's ankle, yeah.
Power of the Doctor, I didn't think was a mess. I thought it held together surprisingly well, and it gave lots of people lots of balanced things to do. I really liked Sophie Aldred and Janet Fielding in it. I thought they were, you know, they fitted into modern Doctor Who quite well with the extra chance to rehearse scenes before shooting them. I think that suited their acting style. I think bringing back the old Doctors, I liked it and I got an emotional kick out of it. I slightly can't get beyond the fact that he did it in two different ways. Coincidentally, in one story, there are two different ways to bring back old Doctors. There's the hologram and then there's the Edge, both of which I think are fine ideas and good ways, neat ways of bringing back old Doctors. But together in one story, it feels a bit like a stretch that McCoy's basically playing two different characters in this. He's playing a kind of Phantom from beyond Regeneration, and he's playing a recorded hologram talking to Sophie Aldred. But again, both of those, I think I could see the sense of both scenes, and that conversation with Sophie Aldred was really powerful, and obviously that gave rise to Tales from the TARDIS ultimately because
thematically that fits in with everything that I was just saying about Chibnall's themes, plus it resonates with the fact that you had 3 Jodie Whittakers at the last episode of Flux, and you've got the Master being the Jodie Whittaker Doctor here too. So it all ties. It does,
but it's rather over-egging the pudding a little bit to have it twice.
It's kind of resolving unresolved business, isn't it? It's because those two companions, particularly, you know, Tegan's departure is very sudden. There's unresolved emotional trauma, and obviously Ace just goes off into the sunset. And either dies or goes off to live in ancient France or wherever.
As it turns out, none of those things.
And I agree. And I agree. Both sets of returning Doctors has a proper purpose to them, and I respect them. Having both sets in one story, I think, is the stretch. But I wouldn't.
I wouldn't be surprised though if it started off as the holograms.
Yes, and then
he goes, "Oh, actually, if we've got Sylvester and Peter, why don't we do a scene where Jodie meets all the past? You know, it's an organic."
I think that's exactly what happened, but that's then potentially more about kind of the actors and the individual characters rather than the story itself. But
it is
watching
it always is though, really, isn't
watching it at the time didn't jar particularly because you're obviously watching it in a linear way and you only like rewatch it or think back after it's finished. But
and you know, reflecting that it was going to be possibly the last Doctor episode before a break, that last scene with the companion support group is a really lovely way to end it. That effects thing. You know, particularly you get obviously William Russell coming back. That, you know, frankly, it's worth its place in the top 2 there just for that moment alone. Because, you know, I did shed a tear or two at that point.
Oh.
So, John, as the man who famously once wrote that Chris Chibnall's best episode was still only 50% as good as Time Lash, what?
Really?
No, I made that up.
I thought I might have done.
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, did you like the power of the Doctor?
Yeah. I
No.
think
Let's move on.
It's generally, it's heading for your your fan gene. It's this is what the story is. This is what you love about the show. We're going to stuff as much of it in as possible. Give those memorable moments. As was mentioned, the Sacha Dhawan doing the Rasputin dance. That was just great. Shouldn't have broken it up in the middle. Should have just let it play out, though.
Right, in first place then, stole it right at the death. And just by, just 2%, 75.2% it landed up on. Jeff Waddle, here comes another one, Matt. You ready for this?
Yeah, okay.
He gave this as 5th. He
Okay.
said, though, it's just the master. It's no relation to the toy maker's motives from, 1966. David Ewan gave this 2nd. Says, brilliant Saturday fun and some really dark moments. I felt enthused for the first time in years to tune in each week watching these 3 specials. And Luke Hammond put this 1st. He said, Neil Patrick Harris strides in, proceeds to chew every bit of scenery he can find, and it's glorious. Oh, and yes, it's a decent introduction for Ncuti Gatwa too. And of course, yes, this is the first time, and I was so pleased, really, because I've always said that doing something different, not necessarily specifically this, but doing something different where the new Doctor gets introduced before the old Doctor goes, to give them chance to spend some screen time together. I think I've said specifically that thing for the last 10 or 15 years is something I'd like to see.
And in
here
the middle
we
of a
find-
story, which is really nice.
Yeah, and here we finally get it, and it gives David Tennant a happy ending, so that for once a regeneration doesn't have to be a death, but can be something joyous instead, which again is something I really like. So I mean, the giggle, I thought it was kind of problematic in terms of, once again, there's no story. In fact, I broke it down, didn't I? I broke it down in our thread. It's really, this entire episode is just basically 4 scenes, 2 of which take place in the same place. But I really enjoyed this. Mark, what did you think of the giggle? And what did you think of By Generation as well? And
I really enjoyed the giggle. It's one of those. I think the return of Doctor Who Confidential, although of course it's called Doctor Who Unleashed, and the Envision commentaries. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it is. I'm not sure it's a good thing, because watching the giggle and watching kind of Neil Patrick Harris do his kind of hammy German accent and sort of all that kind of thing, I was like, ha ha ha, this is great. Then you watch Doctor Who Unleashed and Russell T Davies is like, yes, well, the Celestial Toymaker was always racist. So what I thought I'd do is just write him as a bit of a racist in this, and he was doing all sorts of racist accents and stuff like that. So we don't, and there's a whole argument to be made over whether or not the Celestial Toymaker is consciously racist, or if it's a costume designer who's misread something because anyway, but that's not the thing.
Hasn't it been said as well? I don't know if this is true or not, but hasn't it been said that Russell T Davies has never even seen the Celestial Toymaker?
I don't know about that.
I'm sure I read someone saying that somewhere, probably completely spurious, but who knows?
There's a very good James Curray Smith article about it, which is very much, it's Celestial with a small c, and the kind of the Mandarin stuff. It's worth reading. But on the face of it, I enjoyed it. Then when I kind of heard the kind of intention behind it, I was like, you don't have to keep needling idiots on the internet. As much as I enjoy needling idiots on the internet, you're in charge of Doctor Who. You don't have to also do that. So that was a thing. But I think it's great. It's a big Russell T Davies season finale, which kind of stops in the middle to kind of have some more creepy horror. And again, as with the sort of big Goblin King thing, practical effects as well, which is great. Those puppets were all practical, and then you just had the puppeteers kind of taken out in post, which really adds something, I think, to Catherine Tate's brilliant performance. I know everybody said Catherine Tate doesn't really do much in these specials, and I think that's a fair criticism, but that scene where she just smashes hits a doll off a wall and threatens her 3 puppet children is worth the price of entry alone, to be honest. And on the subject of bi-generation, again, it's the thing about, I don't know if it's a good idea to have Russell T Davies explain everything after the episode goes out, because
Just let it be, yeah.
I was happy with it just being Tennant goes off, has his happy ending, because he's the perfect Doctor and the only Doctor that you can kind of properly do that with. To then have Russell go, oh, so basically what that now means is that all the Doctors split off at the time of that bi-generation. So, well, no, it didn't. How does that?
It does
how
for
does
him.
that work? I
Two
like
things
the
about
idea.
that. Oh, go on.
Well, because in my head, I thought the whole thing of the 14th Doctor is going to go off and work on his trauma so that Ncuti Gatwa can be a sort of freewheeling Doctor free of the past is a great idea, a really lovely clean break. But also it makes sense of the Tales of the TARDIS thing, which is that actually it's all the kind of, subconscious thing of the Doctor kind of working through his past traumas. So it kind of exists in this kind of dream world sort of therapy session, essentially. But now that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, but it does, but actually it's really physically happened. So each of those Doctors get to live on and actually physically do the Tales of the TARDIS. Two things about that. One, Russell T Davies has said it off screen, as it were.
True.
So it's not part of the fiction until another showrunner puts it in on screen as part of the fiction. But then the other thing about that is it's happened while the toy maker was present for the regeneration.
Yes.
So it only works backwards. It doesn't include future regenerations.
Yeah.
But also, what difference? I mean, regeneration's never been a death because Doctors come back. So, and they hand wave the return of the Doctors away with like the Time Lords across the time streams, or, oh, I shouldn't really be here, but I am here. And they get older naturally and they hand wave it away slightly, but they don't really need to. It just gives them another excuse to bring Doctors back. And they're not going to, because let's face it, there's ever diminishing. They're not going to bring Tom Baker back now.
Well, no.
They're not going to have Colin Baker running down corridors and doing anything active, or Sylvester McCoy. So it's literally, God help us, Paul McGann. Eccleston isn't coming back. So it's McGann, Matt Smith, Capaldi won't come back, Jodie Whittaker.
And David Tennant.
But he probably won't come back in the near future because he's already done that. And,
Did you know, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if the unit spin-off has some kind of and special guest star David Tennant as kind of consulting Doctor who they reach out to when things get really bad,
If it does, though, that wouldn't be the end of the world, would it? He wouldn't be
nice if they just had like Donna and Rose in there, and then they just phone the Doctor who's like chilling in the back garden or something. That'd be quite funny.
Coming back to what
turning it off and on again.
Yeah. Coming back to what Matt's just said, metatextually, when the Doctor regenerates, it's not about the death of the character. It's about the fact that actor won't be a regular part of the series going forward for the viewer.
Did see it as a death, didn't he? That's what he said about Out of the End of Time. Yeah. So it's in Russell's conception as sees it as death.
Oh yes, and absolutely.
And a new man walks away.
But this is the other point I was going to make. But emotionally, even if, and because of course none of those Doctors knew that they were going to survive the regeneration. Least of all, David Tennant here didn't know he was going to survive the regeneration. So the main point about it is, within the fiction of the series, the Doctor still believes they're going to die. So the emotional truth of the scene is the Doctor believes they're going to die. All the other characters around them believe that's the last they're going to see of that face on that character. And so the emotional truth of the episode still stands.
So I've become reconciled with the fact that this was intended to give a regeneration story with a happy ending.
Yeah.
And I kind of appreciate, initially I thought it was very self-indulgent. That whole kind of 10-15 minute final section was very self-indulgent because it allowed basically David Tennant to retire to a garden. And I still think that that's the Doctor's worst nightmare, is to retire to a garden. So they give him a TARDIS. So he can travel in time and space with companions. So he's basically the Doctor. So he hasn't really retired. But I've reconciled with the idea that individually in this story it gives it a happy ending. Where I kind of butt up against is the minority of fans on Twitter who are clutching their pearls next to the lapels and saying this has destroyed the canon of Doctor Who forever.
Has anybody? I've not seen any of that.
Just hasn't. I've seen a few.
Okay, because I expected it to go crazy, but I didn't see much. Compared to Time with Children, nothing really for me. But
I think it's one of those things, isn't it? You're never quite sure how it's going to go. And like you said, Russell T Davies has kind of either lent into it or mitigated against it by the comments he said off, sort of.
Yeah, Russell T Davies absolutely thought it was going to be controversial as melon farming possible. He thought,
came out. Yeah, he said
this is a big thing. This changes the series forever, but it doesn't change the series forever. You could still, if you want, get Sylvester McCoy to pop up in a Ncuti Gatwa episode quite happily, and Power of the Doctor proves it, that old doctors aren't really dead. They just pop up here and there in people's heads or in holograms or in reality.
Which just goes back to the point we made earlier, that it only changes things insofar as Russell T Davies writes Doctor Who. And he's got no concept of what anybody else has done with it, despite the fact that he's watched the whole thing. That's it then. Those are the 7 stories. To sum up, I suppose I should ask you, because we've talked about 3 Chris Chibnall ones and 4 Russell T Davies ones. I suppose the question it begs is, how much real difference is there between, I guess, the showrunners on Doctor Who and in particular on these? And I got to say, I don't think massively there is a huge difference between Chibnall and Russell T Davies. I think they essentially do a lot of the same things as each other. I've said it before that I think it's the production team, and I've said it in this episode, that I think the production team sometimes is who leads the sort of tone of the series, and I think that's true in these 2 cases. And I think clearly Russell T Davies is way better at doing certain particular things than Chris Chibnall is. But counter to that, I think Chris Chibnall's better at giving the episodes a sort of narrative substance and a sort of narrative logic than Russell T Davies is. So I think it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really. And for me, I don't think there's a massive amount to pick between these 2. And clearly, as you all know, I pick Stephen Moffat over the pair of them any day. But so, John, I don't know, between Russell T Davies and, because I think you're on the same page as I am with Stephen Moffat, really.
Pretty much, yes.
So the differences or the similarities between the 2, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think Russell T Davies just has a lighter touch to him almost. Chris Chibnall's very much empty, kind of. He wants to emphasize diversity. He wants to tell these stories. He goes back to telling historicals, like in the First Doctor, that that aren't British centric set stories, which again is very commendable. But again, I think Russell is just focused on that character and that emotion, and I don't think Chris Chibnall would have so much of an issue if he was writing old style Who. It feels like he's trying to almost take Doctor Who back to the style of the old show in a lot of ways. There's no, it's not as much about the character, because that doesn't happen as much. And he doesn't quite plan
I don't feel that would have felt so much an issue if you hadn't had Russell T Davies Doctor Who kind of either side of it.
Absolutely.
So I think
they're both together.
If you'd have had the Chris Chibnall Doctor Who first and the Russell T Davies Doctor Who afterwards, the Chris Chibnall Doctor Who would have probably felt much more natural, maybe.
And I mean, I think part of it as well is as much personal circumstance. Chibnall is a family man. He's based down in, is it Dorset, I think, that way?
Yeah.
Whereas Russell Davies is a lot closer to production, and obviously he's a single man. He has more time to. I think he's just got the circumstances of production favour Russell T Davies as well, because neither of them do many drafts, it does appear, from the time. So
No.
that's an important thing.
And Russell T Davies has no idea what a dad is either. Anyway, Matt, Russell T Davies, Chris Chibnall, differences, similarities.
It does feel like there's a difference. I think for me, it's mainly the dialogue. I think Russell T Davies is much niftier with his dialogue and does the same amount of. So in some ways, so my problem with Chibnall has always been explaining everything away, and yet somehow still the plots kind of lose direction for me, or things get confused. Whereas Russell T Davies, the plots are definitely more linear, but also the dialogue is a lot more elegant, a lot neater, and a lot more personality in it, and the jokes work. And I mean, I'm a bit too embedded in the whole thing, but anecdotally from, my brother watching it is now saying, oh, it feels like it's a relief to have Russell T Davies dialogue back and have actual stories and a bit of simplicity about it. So he's back on board with Doctor Who after not being on board with Doctor Who, and part of that's the problem with COVID and sort of chaotic production over however many years. Chibnall had problems with chaotic production, but it seemed to be constantly like working against him. Whereas
it does
now
seem
it
to miss the
feels
potential of some plot lines as well. I think it's like say Revolution of the Daleks. You've got the Doctor trapped in a state. There's a brilliant story to be told there of her trying to escape for hours. You get half a comic episode out of that.
Yeah,
and no, we just roll Captain Jack in and pull her out.
Stephen Moffat would throw those ideas away too, 10 to an episode.
Douglas
but
Adams
throw
as
them,
well.
Yeah, but he'd throw them
Douglas
away with
Adams
a much more nifty bit of dialogue or a much more nifty resolution. That you wouldn't
dialogue
mind.
has more character for both Moffat and for Davies, I think.
But having said that, I think we've been really lucky to have both Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat, especially Stephen Moffat.
I mean,
but do you know what I mean?
Russell T Davies does feel like Henry Ford, basically.
You can have any color as long as it's Russell.
It's kind of a production. It's kind of a production line now, but that's kind of what appeals to people because there's something predictable about it and comforting about it.
But the problem I have with that, and I guess it kind of comes into the difference between, I guess, Chibnall and RTD, but not just Chibnall and RTD, Moffat and RTD as well, is that both Moffat and Chibnall, partly through necessity, I think, for Chibnall because of COVID and things like that.
But also with his first series, very much so.
But we're constantly kind of tinkering with kind of what Doctor Who is and what Doctor Who can be, and that's maybe not a very comfortable approach for a popular show that wants to have a populist audience that kind of knows what they're going to get every week. And I think obviously Russell has his handle on that, and he knows exactly how to do populist Doctor Who, but it doesn't always necessarily guarantee it's going to be great Doctor Who or Doctor Who that pushes the envelope.
I think there's something about JR, which Russell's Doctor Who is very, very much of its time because Russell is so locked into popular culture, so locked into popular TV. The Church on Route Road, working with that ITV. I had no idea there was that ITV Foundling series, and it exists. And you're like, what?
Yeah. The thing is,
Russell T Davies is consistent, but there's less chance of the big highs.
Yeah.
Stephen Moffat was, I think, consistent, and there were more chance of the big highs. I think Chris Chibnall, because of circumstances, was inconsistent, and the big highs didn't come quite as often.
But then I think the big highs, and Russell would have done this as well. I'm not about to state that Russell T Davies would have crumbled under COVID and Doctor Who would have died. But the fact he kept Doctor Who on the air and kind of gave us, I think, one of the most ambitious Doctor Who seasons there's ever been. I think that's something that should never really be forgotten. And I worry that now we've kind of gone back to this kind of slightly more small scale focus on everyday people and things like that, which is great. It was great in 2005, but is it still the kind of Doctor Who we want in 2024? I don't know, especially, against a backdrop of sort of comic book movies and and things like that. It's like I feel like Doctor Who has the capacity to be a bit bigger.
Possibly it's against the backdrop of comic book movies that are slowly becoming less popular.
True.
So it
true.
might be trailblazing
Mm.
a new kind of kitchen sink
Yeah.
mode in culture, potentially.
Yeah, we're gonna get a Spider-Man movie where it's just all Peter Parker taking photos of just robberies and that.
Do you know what though? The thing of it is, when you buy Oasis's third album, you know you're getting the same album as you did when you bought their second album and when
But
you bought their
bigger
first
and
album.
longer.
But when you buy Blur's third album, that's a million miles away from their first album, and it's a million miles away from their fifth album.
Man, it's the second of their albums, a million miles away as well.
Well, but the point I'm making is, with Russell T Davies, you know exactly what you're getting. With Chris Chibnall and Stephen Moffat, you were more in sort of Blur territory, where it might be the same as the one before, but it might also be completely different. And as often as not, it would be completely different. And maybe the sacrifice is, or certainly in Chris Chibnall's case, I think Chris Chibnall is the kind of writer who a lot of other programs would have felt blessed to have. Life on Mars, for example. Chris Chibnall's episodes of Life on Mars are two of the better episodes of Life on Mars, right? But just in the company of Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat, maybe he looks. And I think maybe that's the sacrifice you make, is to get somebody who does try to do something different. Maybe it doesn't work as successfully, but I think overall, I think what I'm saying is, I think there's a place for all of them. And Chris Chibnall I might not like Chris Chibnall as much as I liked Stephen Moffat, but, I think the world is a richer place for having Spyfall and Demons of the Punjab and Flux and Power of the Doctor in it. And I wouldn't be without them, frankly.
No, and I think what you're going to see is the usual thing that happens when an era finishes and when an era's gone and, Doctor Who is safe and going on forever. It'll get reappraised more positively in time. People,
Probably,
the
yeah.
anxieties of time drop
Nostalgia
off.
will kick in.
Yeah,
In about 10 years, nostalgia kicks in, and then that's it.
Still not keen on
And
that
then
first
in
Jones season, but the second half, kind of from Fugitive onwards, I'm a lot more keen on that these days.
Plus, in about 25 years, when we get our second woman doctor, people will be celebrating the fact that we'd had one before. Right, on that note then, until we do this again, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was John.
And I was Mark.
And we will speak again soon.